and welcome to Cult Movie Cult, where we watch and discuss the horrific, the obscure, and the flat-out strange from the other side of cinema. I am Mark Dickerson.
And I'm Jeremy Fink.
And this is part 3 of our series, Lo-Fi Sci-Fi. Today we're going to discuss 1974's Dark Star.
A million suns shine down, but I see only one. When I think I'm over you, I find I've just begun. The years move faster than the days, there's no warmth in the light. And how I miss those desert skies, your cool touch in the night. Benson, Arizona, blue warm wind through your hair. My body flies the galaxies, my heart longs to be there. Benson, Arizona, the same stars in the sky, but they seem so much kinder when we watch them, you and I.
So here we are. Dark Star is a 1974 American science fiction comedy film directed by John Carpenter and co-written by Dan O'Bannon. This is Carpenter is actually his first directorial feature effort. It follows a crew of 4 as they're on the deteriorating starship Dark Star, 20 years into their mission to destroy unstable planets that might threaten the future colonization of other planets. So, pretty good wacky sci-fi concept right off the bat. As we've seen in some other films we've discussed, nice and contained. Mm-hmm. And a thing that struck me right away, just to kind of dig right in, was that, as we noted, this is a comedy film. Yes. So that was something that I kind of found interesting, because right from the get-go, there's this country western song that plays, which you've just heard, which was really surprising for me, because most space and most science fiction movies go with this kind of futuristic soundtrack. And so right away it just throws you into this country western weird space where you kind of get that this crew you're following is going to be a little bit different than what we're used to seeing in sci-fi.
Yeah, that juxtaposition with the opening credits in that song is great. It really gets you into what the movie's going to be like, I guess, because it is more of a comedy, more of a satirical take on a sci-fi space movie, I guess. Although, before we get into it too much, Jeremy, I wanted to mention that the budget for this film is $60,000. So that we're going in descending order. This is the third movie we're talking about for this series. But much like the first movie we discussed, THX 1138, this was also this also began life as a student film that was then expanded upon. So just like George Lucas, John Carpenter and Dan O'Bannon collaborated on this in college, actually in the same exact school, the same exact college, which was USC. And so I thought that was kind of interesting, because that wasn't even something that we had planned, but now that we're looking at it, it's pretty cool, that it started life that way, which is interesting, because I saw they added, when I was reading up on trivia and things like that, I saw that they had added a lot of scenes to make it longer from the student film, and a lot of the scenes of the crew of the space shuttle, just in that enclosed area, just having conversations, a lot of that was added in. So the film prior to that was basically more of a, the alien scenes, and the more, I guess, action-oriented scenes. So I thought that was interesting that they added scenes like that where it was mostly conversations.
Yeah, which is a good way to fill space, though.
Yeah,
to turn it into a feature. It
expands on the backstory somewhat, and like the lore of the story behind this, of what they're trying to convey. So you said you mentioned this is a comedy. As a comedy, how did this movie work for you, Jeremy?
Well, I didn't necessarily think it was funny all the time. Like there were definitely some jokes that didn't land for me, but I kind of appreciated the fact that it wasn't afraid to make human beings seem human. I once again, we're used to seeing this, particularly with space movies, really efficient storytelling that's very to the point, very mission-driven, a lot of technical jargon. And what was kind of fun about this one for me is it showed the actual boredom that 4 people would be up against floating around in space for 20 years, doing something that, by our standards would be really wild and exciting and intense, but by their standards seems kind of mundane and everyday.
Right.
So that was actually kind of nice for me, just because it did seem to separate itself. It didn't feel like, this movie has been kind of talked about before as a satire of 2001: A Space Odyssey, but to me it didn't really feel like a satire necessarily, because it didn't feel like it was about the jokes. It kind of felt like it was its own entity, and the jokes were more just to express that, these are just four guys that were kind of lost and bored out of their minds and sick of each other, as they probably would be after 20 years.
Yeah, they tell you it's been 20 years that they've been in that ship, so it makes sense. Although I wonder how old they were when they got on there. I just realized that, because they're pretty young guys, obviously.
Well, I think it said at one point, one of the characters said, which also the science of this film, it doesn't really dwell on the science too much, which once again, I didn't really have a problem with. It kind of just lets you figure it out for yourself as you go along.
Yeah, I'm remembering what you're about to say, that they said that you age much slower in space, I guess.
Yeah, it was something like they'd been up there for 20 years, but they'd only aged 3.
Yeah, which is a creative way around that problem, and probably makes sense, right? I mean,
well, and I think there are a lot of nice workarounds, in this movie.
Totally.
Probably because of budget, they probably just couldn't afford to hire more established older actors. I would imagine, or because it was a student film where they had already cast these guys, not realizing that it would turn into something more involved. And so it's a good little workaround. You write the science in, and that's, I think, part of the beauty of why sci-fi works in the low budget range, is because you're kind of creating your own rules, and I think John Carpenter did a really beautiful job of that here.
Yeah, so at first glance, this film you wouldn't think of as being lower budget than the other films we talked about, just because it does take place in space, and there are, there's an alien and things like that. Whereas Liquid Sky, we talked about how the alien was more just spoken about, you didn't actually see it. In this movie, there was, like you said, the workarounds. It's really what's interesting about it for their budget, because it's so bare bones, but yet at the same time, there is all the requisite sci-fi, the buttons on the spaceship glowing, and flashing lights, and the fact that they are in space. You do see them traveling through space, so all of that is in there. But the ways that they, the ingenuity they had to for the workaround there is really interesting, and I think that's probably the most interesting aspect of it, because as a comedy, I don't think it worked as well as maybe it wanted to. Although I feel like some of that's projection. I feel like when people look at this movie now, they call it a comedy, but to me, it almost seems like they were a little more serious about it than people would think.
For the most part. There was definitely some parts that I think they would have had no delusions about.
There's certain elements that are very, that obviously are going for comedy there, but for the most part, I feel like it's more introspective, and a lot of that might have to do with the fact that I just saw a screening of 2001: Space Odyssey at my local IMAX theater, and so I have that on the mind, and I just watched this movie, and they definitely, I hate to say the word companion piece, but they definitely, I would say Dark Star was influenced by certain elements of 2001. I mean, how could you not be? That was such a groundbreaking movie. So there are certain elements of that, like the isolation of the crew, and there's an allusion to like the HAL computer towards the end, where they're speaking to the computer. So there's certain elements that I think they were inspired by for this movie. Yeah.
But what's interesting though is I would say that this movie, more so than 2001, influenced another space movie which came out a couple years later, which was Star Wars. And I the reason I say that this had a bigger influence, there's there are some shots that are pretty directly seem to be derivative of this movie in Star Wars, including the opening.
Right.
Like the way the space shots are constructed, and it may just be kind of a zeitgeist thing where these directors, John Carpenter and George Lucas, were looking at the same people, and the technologies that were available to them, albeit very different budget ranges, were kind of similar. But I kind of feel like George Lucas probably saw and liked something about this movie, especially, I mean, there's like the hyperdrive sequence in this movie, which is right there in Star Wars as well. So there's a lot of things that, even though this had a much kind of goofier tone, seem to carry over. And also another reason for that, I think, is that in some interviews I've heard with John Carpenter, he always talks about how he always really wanted to be a Western director. He wanted to do Western movies, like he loved John Wayne, and he wanted to do that kind of thing. And I believe when George Lucas pitched Star Wars, it was called a space Western. So that might also just be another aesthetic thing, that these guys were probably, looking at some of those great studio Westerns of the 50s and 60s. And but the technology and what was exciting in film at that point was space. So they said, how can we combine this? So that, in my mind, is probably also another reason why maybe they end up working nicely next to each other.
And they went to the same school, so I'm sure he was aware of this film in some way. So yeah, just to talk a little bit more about the movie, and then I want to move on to talking about the filmmakers, because I think that's actually probably a little bit more interesting, the fact this was their first movie and where they went from there. But the movie itself, the effects I wanted to focus on, because I was actually pretty impressed by some of this, and I don't know how factual it is. It was taken from just like trivia, so I'll just put it out there. But apparently the double rows of the large buttons on the bridge consoles are ice cube trays.
Oh, interesting.
And they were lit from underneath. So I found that interesting. And then the space helmets themselves that the crew was wearing, they're actually toys that were meant to fit children. So
they did look a little small.
Yeah, they look a little small, and I guess that's why.
But it works. I believe that.
Yeah. So again, these are creative solutions. It's just I feel like, well, necessity is the mother of invention. So I feel like, if you're gonna make a sci-fi space movie, you're going to need to be pretty creative with the effects, and they definitely were.
Mark, were you able to find anything on the elevator shaft sequence? There's a beautiful sequence.
Yes.
Actually, probably the most impressive of the whole film.
The one that stands out the most.
Yeah, it's kind of a centerpiece of the whole thing, where a guy is kind of stuck hanging from the bottom of an elevator in an elevator shaft. And even in, 1970, I guess at this point it would be like $72, $73, I still don't know how they made this one sequence on this budget, because I could easily see that sequence costing $60,000 to make. So were you able to find anything on how they did that? Because I was not.
I did find some information. Again, I don't know how factual it is, but apparently a lot of those shots in the elevator shaft were actually just used with a camera dolly. The dolly was the apparatus that was actually moving the actor. Like that was moving, that what was supposed to be the elevator, and they shot it, I believe, horizontally for a lot of the shots, so it looks like it's coming down, but actually they were just moving it, from side to side, something like that. So that was, I didn't find much more than that, but I'm sure they had to get really creative with the camera angles and the sets they used for that.
Yeah, I was particularly impressed with that sequence, actually, as someone who does a lot of low-budget filmmaking, because that's what I figured they did, and I was looking for signs of that. But there were a few shots where he clearly looked like he was dangling, and the physics of it, unless he has, like, world-class forearm strength and could just prop himself up in a plank without touching anything, I don't have any clue how they did this, other than just having him dangling 60 feet up in an elevator shaft. So there's some either really good trickery or some really dangerous labor violations going on to pull those shots off, because they're pretty stunning. They're pretty impressive.
Yeah, probably a little bit of both.
Yeah.
But, because when I read that, I was like, okay, I can see that for this shot or this shot, but for the sequence as a whole, I agree, Jeremy. I think it's pretty impressive. It's pretty thrilling to watch, and I feel like they couldn't have used that trick for every single shot. So I don't know exactly how the entire sequence was shot, but they like I said, they had to get creative with their camera angles, and I'm sure they, a lot of the shots were pretty tight, so I'm sure they were able to work some kind of magic with that. So yeah, very impressive. I mean, what they were able to do on that budget, I think, is our main, what we're going to be talking about, because at first glance, that certainly doesn't look like ice cube trays to me, and when you know about the helmets, you're like, okay, I can see them being a little small, but you don't really think of it when you're watching it. You just totally give yourself over to the premise. And the fact that all these actors are unknowns, well, Dan O'Bannon went on to be known in a different way as a writer, but the fact that they're all unknowns and likely students kind of adds to that aura, because you're not like, oh, that's this actor who this is his first role or whatever. So I think that kind of adds to it. Yeah, it's just this gang of 4 men, and
floating around.
One of them who's constantly trimming his mustache hairs, which I thought was funny. there are little funny moments in it. I didn't really find myself laughing that much, but it's definitely silly. It has silly moments in it for sure. And I don't think we can avoid it any longer. We have to talk about the beach ball alien because that is the most ridiculous part of it. Probably the most outright silly aspect of the film. When you see it, you're kind of in disbelief that they actually did that. And it's kind of inspired in a way because it is so simple.
Yeah.
It's almost like they didn't even try to not make it look like a beach ball.
Yeah.
So it's almost like they did know, like, okay, this is silly and we don't care. We're just going to put it in there and this is our alien,
It's kind of refreshing.
It is refreshing. And especially because, well, we're going to get more into this, but Dan O'Bannon, went on to create probably the most popular and the most well thought of alien movie, which was Alien. So the fact that he started with the beach ball alien, I find pretty amusing.
Yeah. But I think, especially in low budget like that, I feel like you do see a lot of the time filmmakers try and often fail to create something in that looks living, like a monster or anything like that, or an alien. And the reason for that is because it's believable enough that it's moving and everything, but you can still, something feels off, something feels manufactured. So I think the fact that they unashamedly, they didn't even try to hide the fact that it was just a beach ball. They kind of say, this is what you're working with as an audience member. You're either going to accept it and love it, or you're going to hate it, and too bad, you're lost. It's something very bold and empowering for low-budget filmmakers about that kind of attitude.
Right. Well, you have to use your imagination, which in this day and age, it's, with all the CGI oversaturation out there, I also found it refreshing. I personally thought it wasn't the worst thing that you do have to use your imagination a little bit, and your suspension of disbelief, because I just feel like nowadays it's if this was made now, it would be a CGI alien in every shot, and so the fact that this is the only alien they have, this is what they have to work with. And you do believe it. You do believe that thing is an alien.
Yeah. Because there's no reason. They show it to you. They say, this is our alien, and go. It's very fun.
Yeah, and like I said, that whole sequence in the elevator shaft is, and like you said as well, it's pretty engaging. And so they were able to do a lot with the small amount of money they had. Were you able to find any information about who helped them produce this? Because I doubt they produced it on their own. I'm sure, like Lucas, they probably had someone come in and help out financially wise, at least.
Let me see if I can find anything.
Yeah. Sorry to put you on the spot there. I just was thinking of that in my head.
No, I don't think I caught that. It was probably Francis Ford Coppola. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah. No, I don't know. I'm not seeing any information on here. If we dig deeper, maybe we can put a link down in the description, or just kind of do some kind of write-up about it if we find any more information on that. Or if anyone knows, feel free to chime in and let us know.
Until then, we'll just assume it was Francis Ford Coppola.
Yeah, we'll just assume it was Francis Ford Coppola because somehow he had his hand in every single project that came out of probably the whole state of California 70s. In the 70s. Or, not even just any project in the 70s. Francis Ford Coppola probably had something to do with. So, maybe. But yeah, really, really resourceful, really economical, good filmmaking, and kind of fun and believable. One thing that I was thinking about was the influence of cartoons on this movie. And the reason I say that, and it wasn't the best executed part of the film, I think. But some of the space sequences, he used still photography and then would put some kind of moving effect over it, which is something you see a lot in cartoons, actually. I've actually, to show my inner nerd a little bit, recently with my girlfriend have been rewatching the original Pokemon television series. And something that they do a lot is that if there's a big dramatic moment, to kind of slow it down and make things more intense, they'll actually just use a still image with maybe a moving background. They'll make the characters won't be in. And in reality, it's probably to save costs because they don't have to animate it as much.
It's dynamic, though. I mean,
but it's dynamic, and it gives a certain feeling. I think the way it's used in this film, I don't think it's the best way to achieve verisimilitude, which is what they were going for in this film with it, I think. But there were certain moments where it was kind of just, when it was an emotional decision rather than a practical decision. I think it did work here, and it's pretty interesting and pretty striking because it does give this otherworldly, we don't totally understand how this works feeling. And also culturally at the time, this is, if we're talking 1974, but they started making this in 71, 72, we're only a couple years removed from the moon landing. So for the first time, people are actually seeing space, and the curiosity is really peaked, I would imagine. So kind of getting into this theoretical discussion of space, both visually and in the way the characters are talking to each other and the robots.
They do mix the silliness with the introspection and, like I said, the isolation and the vulnerability of being in space. I mean, that also harkens back to 2001, and it was something that Dan O'Bannon would later explore more in Alien. Obviously, this is a more like slight and comical take on those themes, but now that we're talking about it, let's discuss the filmmakers a little bit, because, like I said, I think that's a very interesting aspect of this. John Carpenter, who, let me get all the roles here, because both of these men took on a couple different roles. So John Carpenter was a writer, a producer, and director, and he also did the music, which he would go on to do for many of his later films, including probably most famously Halloween. And then Dan O'Bannon, he was a writer as well. He also was the editor, and he acts in the movie. He's one of the only cast members. Yeah, one of the only characters in the film on the crew. So this was the first film for both of them, besides, I'm sure, some other shorts they probably made in school. What do you think that these two men learned from this film that they carried on to their other work?
Well, for me, so I'm, to be totally upfront, way more into John Carpenter than Dan O'Bannon. So for me, just looking forward, I think stylistically, there are a lot of things that you would see in later John Carpenter films that you could point right at this movie and say, oh, that's where that's coming from. He was starting to explore that. Obviously, the big John Carpenter film that gets talked about the most is Halloween, which I think I didn't rewatch Halloween this year, but last year I went and saw a midnight screening of Halloween, and the thing that I think gets forgotten is how funny that movie is. Despite its more twisted themes, and I think that at that point John Carpenter had developed as a filmmaker enough to kind of balance those things in a way that maybe tonally didn't always work in this movie. And then my favorite John Carpenter movie, though, is actually They Live. And I think the thing that this movie had that They Live also had was, despite absurd circumstances, it still was making a point. Yeah. It still was deeply thought provoking, and could balance its it could balance its silliness with its seriousness. One thing I had this little chat with another filmmaker who I'll give a little shout out to right now. Actually, he's part of a team called Rivera Senate. His name is Matthew Rivera, and him and his partner make these really interesting 16mm film noir short films, so check them out if you get the chance. But we were talking about a week ago, and he said great filmmakers, they can't just give you vegetables. They have to feed you vegetables and make it look like candy. They have to hide the healthy thing inside the exciting thing. And I think that's something John Carpenter in this film was starting to get at, and as he got into his later work, he really, really learned how to do. So for me, this was just the beginning of what would become one of the most prolific examples of a filmmaker who's able to do exactly that: give you vegetables but make it look like candy.
Yeah, and all of Carpenter's films do have that sense of fun about them. Some more than others, but obviously you can see the beginnings of that here. And the way it's shot as well, I thought, with what they had, again, I thought he did a pretty good job with it. The ships are mostly those tight, compact spaces, but there's a lot of detail. There's a lot going on. If you look around the frame, besides the blinking buttons and screens and all that, just the depth of some of the shots inside the ship, it really gives you an illusion of something grander, which is kind of, and it's at its core what we're kind of getting at when we talk about these low-budget sci-fi movies, because they don't have much, but they're trying to tell a grand story, an elaborate story, and so the filmmaking and the shots that they choose, that helps. So I noticed that a lot in this movie, because the scenery doesn't change up that much, but with what they had, they made it work, and
it felt huge. The space felt massive.
Right, that's what I was getting at. Yeah, it feels expansive. It feels like there's a lot going on, in the background and in the scenery and things like that. Like it's believable. It's believable as that these people are on this ship for 20 years.
Yeah.
I think it is. And then so Dan O'Bannon, to go back to him, because I love Carpenter as well, but for some reason I think of this as O'Bannon's movie more than I mean, I'm sure it was equal parts, but when I think of this movie, I just think of Dan O'Bannon because he does go on to write Alien, and and that's still in almost the same exact territory as this,
Yeah.
thematically at least. So Alien is Dan O'Bannon further exploring what he began to explore in this in a more comical and silly way. And like I said, this is a more comical version of that type of story, but also like in Alien, in this film, though it's more for budgetary reasons here, it's what you don't see. And that's also another staple of these kinds of movies. It's, using your imagination like we talked about. And this movie is definitely more about the men aboard the ship and their conversations and their thoughts about their situation. And a lot of Alien is the same idea. It's, a lot of the scenes, there's not much action going on at all. There's not even any suspense. It's just the crew all together in a room talking, planning something. Sometimes they're just bullshitting, and I think that's just you can see the beginnings of that here. But I can see those themes, and Dan O'Bannon, he didn't have like the most illustrious career, but he is well regarded. Just mostly for Alien, but also he directed Return of the Living Dead.
Yeah, he carved out his place.
Yeah, so he had his place, and I just see the most clear correlation between his work, but obviously Carpenter, I love Carpenter, and to see his beginnings is definitely entertaining and interesting. And if you are into his work at all, you should definitely watch this movie, just to say you've seen them all.
Yeah. So what's interesting with this film, I think, too, to take into consideration is the influence that it went on to have years later, and not necessarily just this film, but kind of the attitude towards this film. So one of my favorite directors is Robert Rodriguez, who I'm sure, this is the Cult Movie Cult podcast, so I'm sure if you're listening to this, you're probably all very familiar with Robert Rodriguez. But he has this book, Rebel Without a Crew, which, in my opinion, is a must-read. Yeah, must-read for any filmmaker, whether your aspirations are to be, an independent filmmaker or to direct studio movies, just because it's a good peek into all parts of that. But I think that the way he made El Mariachi and his, El Mariachi style of filmmaking probably wouldn't exist without John Carpenter. And specifically the way this movie is made, I think this movie is probably the thing that gave John Carpenter to have the confidence to pretty much be involved in every step of the process in his own movies. And if you look at it, like El Mariachi was pretty much the film that kicked off the whole 90s independent cinema movement. The American Indies and the Sundance generation and all of that. And Robert Rodriguez, like a lot of people don't even know, he does his own music as well. He really looked up to John Carpenter. One of my favorite is the Planet Terror soundtrack. I'm not the hugest fan of that movie, but I listen to the soundtrack over and over and over again.
I can see that.
And it's one of those things where, like, this style of filmmaking, people overseas were doing this at this point. You had all those French New Wave filmmakers who were making films for nothing, but there weren't a lot of American filmmakers doing this kind of thing. And the fact that they were able to pull this off is a pretty monumental feat, especially because they didn't necessarily have the kind of support that a George Lucas had or other filmmakers like that.
I agree. That book is definitely a good one to read. It is, I think relevant still today to people that want to make independent films, and that the 90s was kind of like it's one of my favorite periods for independent film. I feel like it was kind of like the Wild West in a way, and a lot of exciting ideas were getting out there. People were making movies their own way, and there was a lot of fresh filmmakers out there. And I think it's also kind of goes back to this time that we're talking about with THX and Dark Star, and this University of Southern California, and the offspring from that. I think people were taking these kind of out there ideas and just making it. They were just going for it, with whatever budget they had. And it would lead to things like Alien and Star Wars and all these much larger budget movies, obviously. But, you got to start somewhere. And it's really cool to see where these filmmakers started out. and I think it fits into our series pretty well here. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it works in really nicely. I think it's kind of a nice midway point too. Because soon we're going to be getting into some like really
We're going
low budget stuff
down there, yeah.
to the point where this is homemade to an extent, but still had some support behind it. But we're going to get into some stuff that is literally like homemade. So yeah, I think it's a good midway point, especially because these guys kind of did every step of the process.
Yeah.
It felt like a real friends and family kind of production. So Mark, any moments other than the beach ball alien, because that's the one obviously I think everyone kind of remembers from this. But any moments that really just stood out to you that were interesting, exciting, challenging.
Yeah, the beach ball alien is it's just the first thing you think of when you see this movie. It was the first clip I had seen. Someone had sent it to me before I'd even seen this movie. And to me, that's like the ultimate in low budget solutions to creature effects. So I really enjoyed that. But yeah, like you're asking if there's other moments. I would say like towards the end, that whole ending, I thought it was pretty thought provoking because it does call back to the HAL computer, the sentient computer from 2001. It kind of alludes back to that in a comical way. They're kind of poking fun at it a little bit, or poking holes in it, I guess. But I think that's pretty entertaining to watch. And then the very ending is when he's basically surfing in space. You really can't beat that. It's pretty out there. So, and they do allude to him surfing earlier. So it kind of, it does make sense in a weird sort of way, in a surreal kind of way. But yeah, I would say between the beach ball alien and that ending, I think those are the two moments that stood out to me the most. How about you?
Yeah, I think the surfing ending, which once again, I mean, we're already 30 minutes into this episode, so if you haven't figured out, we're gonna have some spoilers in this one.
Yes, we tend to spoil things.
Probably should have said that in the first 2 or 3 minutes, but yeah. So
if you're listening to this far, I think you probably know.
You've probably figured out that we're going to spoil it. So the surfing ending was a big one for me. Like I said, just the music. I love the fact that it didn't have a traditional sci-fi soundtrack. These images of space, which I guess is something that Kubrick kind of did as well. I think with the classical music, I think it probably would have felt more revolutionary at the time than it does to us now, just because so many people have copied Kubrick. I honestly can't, maybe that's out there, but I can't really think of other examples I've seen where there's country western music playing during lofty, beautiful space sequences.
That's interesting. I wonder if that was on their minds when they were thinking of what music to put in there. Like, okay, Kubrick used
classical. We're gonna
use classical. We're gonna use this. I wonder if that was part of the decision.
But one little sequence, and I'm not even really sure why this is just sticking with me. But it's when they are just like all of the crew members are just kind of talking directly into a camera with a white background and just kind of expressing their grievances and their little complaints. And
oh yeah, I did like that part.
Just the minutia of it, I don't know, for me, I love good character work. And I don't think these are necessarily the best characters in the world. I think there was a lot that could have been improved upon, but just those little tiny details like that they were just fun. It just is a different kind of thing than most space movies you see.
Yeah, they're kind of putting on voices and like having a little bit of fun, almost talking directly to the audience, like talking to the camera.
Yeah.
Another thing that the film did well, actually, this just reminded me of it when you brought up this sequence, is they do give you a good sense of the crew starting to lose their grip on reality. Which is something you don't see all the time in movies that take place in space, but to me it makes total sense. Like if you're going to be up in a spaceship in the vastness of space for 20 years, like you're going to lose it a little bit. So I like that, when he's like shooting the gun aboard the ship, like that was another moment that I thought like was interesting. And they do mention it has been 20 years up there, so it makes sense. So you're floating around in space for that long, like you're going to start to like lose it a little bit. And I think that sequence that you brought up where they're speaking like directly to us, like almost it's that brings that to mind as well.
And the kind of lack of procedure as well. I think there's this misconception that people who are in really technical fields, like people, astronauts, or one thing I think about all the time is like surgeons. People who aren't surgeons or don't know any surgeons. I think we have this kind of idea that surgery is this very clean thing, like cutting a steak, very delicate. But it's like a pretty violent thing. It's pretty messy and all over the place. And I would imagine that space travel is really similar. I recently just watched Damien Chazelle's new film, First Man. And I think one thing that he expressed beautifully was how, particularly in 1969 when we were going to the moon, is kind of how lo-fi it was. Like in our minds, I think we think of all these computers we have now, but back then they didn't really have that same kind of computing power and everything. So just how messy and human it all is, that people are making mistakes, they're figuring things out as they go along. Like there's one thing early in this movie where these guys are asking for protection from radiation, and the guy at the base on Earth is feeding back and saying, "Oh, sorry, it's out of our budget." It's like those kind of little human elements that. Yeah, I don't want to say this felt more real because I don't know what space travel is like, but I would imagine that it is more real than a lot of space movies because of how unassuming and utterly stupid it was sometimes, because people can be utterly stupid,
right?
Especially in high pressure situations where they don't know what they're doing.
Right. Yeah, there's a different element to it that they kind of bring attention to in this movie, and again, a lot of it I'm sure is for budgetary reasons. Like, okay, let's pad the length of the movie by having a scene where they talk to each other, but because they added those scenes in, I think that really adds a lot to the movie overall. Like it makes it unique. It makes it even more unique, I think, because like you said, a lot of these kinds of movies you don't really see that aspect of it. So I think it's I think it's worth watching, even just for those moments, really.
Yeah, I agree.
Even the effects aside, I think just the almost like naturalistic. It's funny because, again, these are clearly not actors, or at least not professional actors. But yeah, there's something about these performances. Just like they're almost very naturalistic and very.
They feel like a real crew, and probably they are a real crew, not a real space crew, but like
probably the crew of the film.
The crew of the film, but because of that, it does feel like I could actually see these guys in pretty much any situation. Yeah, it goes actually interacting this way.
It kind of goes back to Liquid Sky too, just to tie it into one other movie that we talked about, where we talked about how the cast was like you've almost felt the familiarity with each other there. You almost felt the camaraderie, and you can feel that like tenfold in this movie because like it's just four of them, and in this tight enclosed
can't escape
space,
each other. Yeah,
they can't escape, and you just get that feeling when you watch it, which you can't get from a big budget movie. You just can't. Yeah. Not the same way, at least. So that was Dark Star. And I think we covered a lot about it and talked about the filmmakers a little bit. But as Jeremy, as you mentioned, we're going down. We're going even further down. Next, we're going to talk about another very famous actor, sort of semi-filmmaker, right? Peter Fonda. He made a movie called Idaho Transfer, and there's a lot of similarities between this movie and that one. This one that we're going to talk about, probably even lower budget, even more bare bones in a way. So I can't wait to talk about that. And Jeremy, is there anything else you wanted to add about this one?
No, just a good watch. A lot of fun. Fans of either Dan O'Bannon or John Carpenter, I think, definitely worth seeing. This one, as of now, as of November 2018, is available on Dailymotion for free.
Yes.
So, get out there and watch it.
I don't know if we can even say that, but...
Well, if we can't, then we'll just bleep it out.
Yeah, we'll bleep it out. Now, a lot of these movies, it's actually amazing how easily you can find these things. But not that we advocate it, but what are you gonna do?
Check it out. Yeah.
In certain situations, you got to do what you got to do. So check it out. It's easy to find. It's also just like a good chill out movie, like just to put on like the background, just kind of like space out. Not to use that pun there, but I really didn't mean to do that. But just kind of a throw it on kind of movie, and it's enjoyable.
Yeah,
so
keep on surfing.
And keep on surfing. All right, so this concludes the third part of our series Lo-Fi Sci-Fi, where we talked about Dark Star. Next time we're talking about Idaho Transfer. Thank you for listening to Cult Movie Cult. You can find us on iTunes and Podbean. We're on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. If you have any cult films you'd like to hear us discuss on the show, please feel free to reach out to us at cultmoviecult@gmail.com. This has been Cult Movie Cult, and until next time, so long from the other side.